Okay, we're here today with Keelan Cook. He's the director for the Center of Great Commission Studies at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. Keelan, I'm glad to have you here. I know you've had a lot of varied experiences in West Africa, I understand, as well as at the uh, Union Association there in Houston. And I'm just glad you're with us today. Uh, at this AMS Diaspora Cohort, we've had the opportunity to take a look at everything from getting things going here locally to being able to address a people group here locally and then go where they are internationally. But finding and recording and being able to determine who the people are where we serve is what I know is a passion for you. So, if you don't mind, the next 30, 40 minutes are yours. And I appreciate you being with us today. Thank you.
Yeah, no, so I'm happy to do it and love what you guys are doing with this cohort. In fact, so it's exciting to me to see increasing momentum behind this conversation about diaspora missions and how we do this stuff in the states. There's a lot of resources now that I don't think were out there even 10 years ago
Yeah.
concerning how to do this stuff. And so it's neat that we've got these work groups that are starting to form. You've got the Diaspora Missions Collective now. The IMB's got a legit full-blown team on the ground in the states now helping train people in this. So there's some good stuff out there that's happening now. So it's an encouragement. That said, today I think the thing that makes the most sense for me to focus on, at least, because I know you guys are talking about all kinds of different things with this group, is how do we start doing people group discovery in the areas where we find ourselves in a way that doesn't take an anthropologist. I'm adding that last part when I talk about this because it really matters. I find so at a high level, if you're thinking at a network level. So when I was out in Houston, and that's where a lot of this stuff I started kind of forming opinions on how to do some of these things. Uh,
Sure.
there was a couple of different strategies or things that we were often thinking through. And I found when I talked to people in associations at other levels, uh, these were often the questions you were thinking, right? So, first off, we know this is a thing. Question one: how do we engage in this work? And it tended to break down into two big buckets for me. One bucket is the best strategy to find some kind of trained insider to engage their own people or near culture peoples in the work. So that's method or approach to engaging in diaspora work. Or bucket two, is it in some sense, those of us in the association at a network leadership level, is it our responsibility to get our churches to develop some cross cultural competencies in order to reach these new people that they find around themselves? So it's more like a grassroots. Do we get local church, usually our regular old pew sitters, right? Do we get them to somehow engage in a lay ministry that works toward doing something with diaspora missions? And as far as I'm concerned, the answer to that question is more of a yes to both answer than a one or the other. And I've watched people in different cities as they're trying to develop a strategy uh, feel like it has to be one or the other, and I don't think it does. In fact, I feel like those of us at a network level, we probably need to figure out how to keep both of those plates spinning because there's strengths and weaknesses to both. And there's a space where on one side, when we can find and identify people who are insiders, they're often going to make the best missionaries or engagers in and among that group anyways. And so yeah, there's super high value here. We don't need to forsake that approach. At the same time, those of us who are responsible for helping our churches be on mission, then we actually have an obligation to our churches to say this is a thing that you should be engaged in. And so, how do we look at both, right? Well, if you're thinking about skilled insiders for an engagement strategy, you've got to there's two or three things that you need to think through. And that's not what I want to spend the majority of our time on. I want us to look at the other side of it, actually. And how do we get our regular old churches to think through doing people group discovery without any background in anthropology?
Sure.
But if you're talking about that first bucket, how are we identifying connecting with skilled insiders for some kind of engagement strategy, right? There's several things you got to do on that side. We're developing networks for identification. That may be networks in our own city. It may be networks with other areas in the world. I know increasingly now you're seeing these affinity based networks that are national. It's groups from all over the country who are coming together to communicate and collaborate about engaging and reaching a particular group. One of the most recent ones that I've heard getting some real traction is among Afghan refugees, right? And so there are now meetings that are national meetings that are happening. I know there was one in Dallas a while back where people who are working among Afghan peoples here in the States, they all congregated. And so those kind of networks for identification, valuable thing for that. In addition to that, you're going to have to adopt some kind of process for assessing and equipping those insiders to engage in the work, right? So we're trying to find them, then we're trying to create some structures that allow us to assess and equip them for that work. And then, of course, if they're going to engage in the ministry, we've got to create some form of support network for that ministry. There's a bunch of different contextual ways to do that. Network to network, it may look different how that support happens. It may be churches in the area helping support the work. It may be self-supported work. It may be fundraising. Who knows? And that's just the money side. That's not the care and counsel and encouragement and all that kind of stuff as well. So you've got a lot of questions to answer there. Right? So that's that strategy. Well, now, when it comes to people group discovery, I tend to stick that side, or at least where I've got the most traction with this conversation, is in the other bucket, and that's the one that I think is really helpful for us to look at today. Is how do we really engage in that other bucket side of this? So if you're in a network leader role, you've got however many churches you have in your association, and many of them we're talking, basic majority culture, good old American churches, if you want to call them that, are now confronted with a world around them that has shifted enough. We've got all these different peoples from all over the world that are around us. What's the responsibility there? And again, I'm of the opinion that we have, as network leaders, a responsibility to help those churches see their responsibility in a setting like this. And so, what does that look like to engage in it? What we wound up doing, so I've been working on that question now for at least 10 years. We started, even before I went to Houston to work at the association there, we started trying to answer some of that question here at the seminary. It was a conversation that we got into with NAM and the IMB at the time about the need really to do some form of people group discovery in the United States. Back then, in fact, you guys may remember this graphic that the IMB used to use. It had a map of the world, right? And that map of the world had different dots on it. And some of the dots were red or yellow or orange based on unreached status. And then they had a green dot. And the green dot was the one for an area that was what they would class as reached. And you looked at the map and it had all these dots all over the place, but America was 100% green, the way that that graphic represented it, because it was talking about unreached people groups. Well, here's the dirty little secret of that map, by the way. It was a good and helpful map. I'm not saying that anybody was trying to pull a fast one here, but we just didn't have data on the United States.
Right.
And so they averaged it out as reached compared to the rest of the world and just slapped green on the whole thing. And that overlooked the glaring reality that of the 250 million national or global migrants that we have in the world, almost half of them, about 40% of them, are in the United States. So
Hmm.
far and away the biggest receptor country of immigration. And that's, that whole conversation was before some of the more recent conversations we've been having here in the last year or so about immigration. And so it's a bit of a to say that this it wasn't an issue for us. And both of the mission agencies back then were at a spot where they were coming to this realization. They're saying, hey, we've got to figure out something. How do we even find people groups here in the US? And we got involved in the middle of that here at the seminary. And one of the things that we were trying to accomplish was developing some reproducible methods that could actually
Mhm.
be rolled out uh, with lay folk in churches. And so we pulled the bar way down. It didn't become, hey, let's go hire a team of anthropological experts. Let's go hire a team of demographers and figure out how we can just send them to a city for a year and map that city, and then send them to a city for a year and map that city. There may have been some benefit to a strategy like that, but the downsides are obvious. If you've been in a city where diaspora missions is a thing, you realize that within a year, the data's old, it's stale. And so by the time we'd been able to gather a city and then move our specialists on somewhere else, the data would have started being wrong again. And so what we need is not somebody that we can pay who's an expert in the work to go and do a bunch of data collecting. Instead, what we need is to develop some methods where people who are in a context can learn how to continually discover the area that they're in. And that's a very different bar to set. What we wound up doing was creating a project that we referred to here as the People's Next Door Project. That's what we called it, for want of a better term. And we started trying to figure out some ways to engage local churches in the work of doing people group discovery and engagement. And I'm using all those words in a particular way on purpose. So you can see the aim there. Local churches, this is actually aimed at our regular old, and for us, we're Southern Baptists. So for our regular old Southern Baptist churches, to be able to both see the need and have the necessary equipping to discover, find out who's here, and engage, begin the process of gospel ministry among those in the diaspora that have been brought around us. And so that was the aim of the project. We didn't create methods so much as we were aiming at frameworks. Let me talk a bit about the distinction there. One of the things that we discovered early on as we were working with this, and it stands to reason. If you've been a missionary overseas, you understand the reality of this. If you've worked in multiple cities in the States, so if you've been a network leader in two different cities, you immediately understand the import of what I'm about to say. Uh, had we come up with a method or a playbook, it would have worked somewhere, and then it would have not worked in a whole bunch of places because methods are contextually bound. That's just a truth of missionary strategy to begin with. In fact, it's the reason the IMB has developed their missionary equipping out in the way that they have in the last several years. So, if you're familiar with the IMB's structure and what they do, they've got a thing they refer to as the core missionary task, right? So the core missionary task has got six components to it. It's entry evangelism, disciple making, it's healthy church formation, leadership development, and then partner to exit. So they've got this framework. That language is intentional. What they don't have is a one size fits all strategy that they try to apply in every place in the world. What they have done is instead of looking at the context, they've looked at the scriptures and they've said, what is the responsibility given to us in the scriptures for the missionary task? What's the framework that should be at play no matter where we are? That's more Bible bound than it's context bound. And so if you can develop a framework, then that becomes the skeleton for people to be able to develop their own methods that are still faithful to the scriptures wherever they find themselves. And that becomes a reproducible way to approach this model. So that's what we started trying to do, right? Was develop some form of framework that we could use in order to engage in this work that would be reproducible from place to place, and then becomes a tool or a resource for network leaders to be able to sit down with individual churches and say, "Hey, let's learn this framework well. Let's understand the value and the benefit of doing this work, and then let's uh, let's see how you can uniquely have methods that engage in this work in your context with your people to do your thing." So that's the scope of the project, right?
Mhm.
Now, what we were doing with that, there's a couple of, and I've got some resources I'm happy to give you guys. I've got a couple of little things that we developed that I'm going to pass on to you at the end of the thing here, so that we can get this stuff dispersed and you can see exactly what we've done and how I talked about it. But there were really three big pieces of this for us. Uh, Piece one that we found that we had to do to be able to engage in this work well at a network level was raise awareness and create a biblical responsibility to engage. So that's piece one of this. So right out of the gate, one of the main aspects of what we were trying to do with the People's Next Door project was raise awareness, create a biblical responsibility to engage. That piece of it. So many of our churches that we engage with, at least 10 years ago, I'd say it's less now. I think more churches are just understanding the need for this than used to, but many of them didn't even know it was a thing, right? So you
Mhm.
started at absolute zero, completely clueless to the idea that there's something at all that needs to be done here. And so that was one piece of this, is
Mhm.
letting those churches know. But the other was creating a biblical responsibility for churches. There might have been some churches that saw different things in their built environment around them changing, because that's usually how it went, right? Church sees an Indian restaurant go in, or a mosque, or all of a sudden now everybody in the church is talking about, hey, did you see that happened? And so there's some awareness that's created.
Right.
But what do we do with that awareness? That then becomes a really important question, I think, for how we're going to deal with this issue in general. Um, there's some healthy things we can do with that awareness. There's probably some unhealthy things we can do from a biblical perspective, and helping create a biblical responsibility that's now given to us. Uh, that's just kind of key piece here. That's a front end of what we were trying to do with churches. Now, part of that for us, we found, and this was, I mean, this was years ago. I think nowadays it's probably even more critical than it was in the past. But a big piece of creating that biblical responsibility, at least, was being able to differentiate between the policy conversation that surrounds immigration and the Great Commission conversation that we churches must be having if we're going to be faithful to the environment, the setting that the Lord has called us to engage in mission, right? And so how do we differentiate between those? That's not to say we necessarily take a side in the policy conversation. It's not even to say the policy conversation is unimportant. It is to say that it's different than the Great Commission conversation. There are questions about the policy stuff that need to be answered. However, there's also some, ample biblical challenges and calls for us to share the gospel with anybody that can fog a mirror, right? And if that's true, then what is our responsibility in the setting where we find ourselves, regardless of how a policy conversation turns out at the political level? So part of it was having some of that conversation. Nowadays, I think that's probably going to be a fever pitch for us, is trying to
Okay.
figure out how to help churches navigate a distinction there. How do we have our, how do we chew gum and walk at the same time on this issue?
Sure.
That's an important question for us moving forward. So a big piece of this, like I said, step one, raise awareness, create biblical responsibility.
Okay.
Step two, and this was the piece that I think we stumbled into. We knew we'd need to do that first part. We stumbled into this next one. And so step two is raise confidence that churches and lay people in churches can actually engage in this work. And I phrase it that way on purpose. You've got to raise a confidence level. Um, One of the things that we have found, and I don't know, so I mean, I'm a former IMB missionary myself, but one of the things that we have found over the years, kind of engaging in this work and trying to help associations figure out a strategy for doing it. Maybe inadvertently, I would assume it's been unintentional, but those of us who have been missionaries overseas, when we talk about the work that we have done, we often inadvertently turn ourselves into specialists, if that makes sense.
Okay.
And you talk about the need for contextual and cultural sensitivity, the need to be able to navigate these difficult cross cultural relationships. And man, had I not known that I needed to never shake with the left hand, I may have burned down my access to that village, and those people have never heard about Jesus, and they'd all died and gone to hell. And I mean, there may be some truth to that statement, but if we're not careful, we unintentionally mount this perspective of engaging in cross cultural work that you can only do it if you're an anthropologist, or you can only do it if you have some kind of cross cultural expertise. And so this is work that's best left to the experts, right? And you got to kill that attitude if you want local churches to pick up the work.
Right.
We've got to find some way to make that idea die. Now, are they going to make mistakes along the way? Of course they are. But here's the thing that I would challenge every one of my missionary friends with. So did you. And one of the things I often tried to do as we were engaging with local churches in this work was point out the fact that, so if I'm talking to Southern Baptist churches here, we're talking International Mission Board. I was an IMB missionary. I know how they train IMB missionaries because I got the training. And so I went up to the farm there at FPO and I did my field personnel orientation. And it was 8 weeks back then. It was 8 great weeks of what I would say, and I do believe this is the best cross-cultural and missionary equipping that you can get of any agency out there. It's the Cadillac equipping that at least Western missionaries can receive. But when I landed in country, the door to my airplane opened, and I did not know a stitch of the language or the culture or the worldview of the people that I was going to engage. And what do you mean? Well, here's the thing. That's not a failure on the IMB's part. The IMB was not trying to teach me an expertise in the language in that 8 weeks. That's not possible. Or trying to teach me the expertise of all the cultural nuances of that particular group that I was going to. There's 300 of us there, and we were going all over the world. There's no way they could teach all of us about the uniqueness of our group. But what they did teach was cultural acquisition. So they taught us how to learn about culture and learn the language, right? That's a
Right.
very key distinction. And it's the thing you got to remind missionaries who've been seasoned for a while. When you first went to the field, you weren't an expert in your culture and you weren't an expert in the group that you were trying to engage. What you've been taught was good tools about how to learn about it. That for us became a really key piece of helping churches lean into discovery. If we can raise the confidence here in our churches and say, no, 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 we don't actually need experts. In fact, you not being an expert might help you be good at discovery because it means you're in a position to naturally ask questions. If you go in a learner, that's how you do discovery. And so the posture of a learner becomes a really important piece of it. And so we're raising awareness, creating that biblical responsibility. Two, we're trying to raise their confidence. You can, in fact, engage in this work, and it takes a posture, not a level of knowledge, to start. Now we're going
Right.
to become experts over time, right? We're learning about them, and through the years, as we develop our processes of discovery, and we find these different groups, and we build these relationships, there's a spot where you'll look back and go, you know what, I probably am my area's expert in this. But that's a thing that develops over time, right? So those are the two big components. But then we get to the framework. What is the framework for trying to engage in this work? And I've already pointed out there's two components here: discovery and engagement, and frameworks, not specific methods. I think it's important that we go in with a framework and not the methods. We've already talked about that being the case, but I'm genuinely convinced that's an important aspect of this. Now, the way that we laid it out was it really a simple. It almost feels like the core missionary task. The funny thing is, we designed this before the core missionary task that the IMB uses got published, and it's eerily similar in some ways to the way that the IMB has skinned their core missionary task, which was confidence inducing for us. After that came out, we're like, okay, we're not too far off with a good missionary framework here. But what we simply did was lay out some kind of steps that I think that you need to engage in. And I've got a graphic here. Like I said, I will leave a link to this. And so as you've got this recorded and we want to pass it on to people, I've got about a little 6-page document that is a
Okay.
bit of an executive summary. And that's what
Right.
we give to a church. So when we started in this work, we'd say, hey, here's our 6-page summary on it. Read this. It'll hopefully prime the pump for a bunch of questions for you. And then we can sit down over a cup of coffee and we can talk through, is this the kind of thing that your church is going to want to engage in? What are the steps that we can do? How do we build your plan? That kind of stuff, right? So I've got
That's
a
fine.
resource.
Yeah. Just send it to me.
Yeah,
That's fine, Keelan, and I'll be
yeah,
glad to
I'll do it.
send it.
But so the phases in it for us are simply this: it starts with mobilizing your church.
Hmm.
From there, we try to discover some people groups. We then begin engagement, which hopefully leads to starting some Bible studies.
Hmm.
As these Bible studies start forming for us, we're identifying leaders, and then we need a process to equip those leaders. And then hopefully we're in a position to either plant churches or have this group engage or partner in some sense with existing churches. It gets really contextual at that point. But that's the idea, right? From mobilizing the local church to there now being either a church planted or some kind of group that's fully formed and started. So that's your process. And it breaks down, like I said, over those two big phases: discovery and engagement. Now, the two phases I think matter for us. We've got um, this idea of discovering people groups. You're looking for really two things. There's kind of two questions here in discovering people groups. Where are they and who are they? A lot of times, I think people only focus on that first question. Where are they? Right? But discovery is about more than knowing which apartment complexes they live in. So we've also got to be able to figure out exactly who it is that we're engaging with. But you need both of those. That first idea of where are they? We're going to need to know where our one who is here to start with. That's the general question that discovery is asking: is who's
Sure.
here in the first place? As we start trying to figure that out, to answer that question, you need to know where they are and who they are. So, the where they are, we're going to be looking for this is what you typically think of as mapping. We're going to be looking for points of interest where we can engage particular people. And we know that if we go there, we're going to be able to have some conversations with those people. We're going to be looking for points of residence. There may be some, the fancy term for this is called an ethnic enclave. And so we're going to be looking for ethnic enclaves or particular areas of our city where there's a much higher concentration of a particular group that we're wanting to develop an engagement strategy for. Of course, these become really important for us as we look to, uh, as we look to create a strategy. If I'm thinking church planting at this point, and there's a sizable enough number of this particular group, and we think they're going to need a church in their language here, then I'm going to aim for one of these areas of concentration. It would be foolish for me to put it on the side of the town that nobody's in, right? And so the mapping becomes very important for that. It also is important for evangelistic engagement. If you've got local churches that are going to want to that say, "Hey, we want to do this. I'd love for some of our folk to get a heart for this particular people group. Maybe we have a missionary that we're already partnered with overseas that
Mhm.
works with this group there, and we'd love to work with them here." Right? That's often a connection that people make with this one. They say, "Well, we'd love to be able to engage those people in gospel ministry here." Well, you're going to need to know what coffee shop, what bakery, what dry goods market you're going to need to send your church's people to where they can naturally intersect with those people, right? So that's the where are they piece. Uh,
Mhm.
there are some really easy ways to do where are they. I think here is where a lot of people start getting unnecessarily overcomplicated.
Okay.
And I'll come back to that in a second because that's the nuts and the bolts of it. We'll talk about here in just a second. The who are they though? Who are they is as important for good gospel ministry as the where are they.
Okay.
You got to understand the culture and the worldview of the people you're trying to reach if you want the gospel to make sense to them. Now, again, we're not going in an expert, we're going in a learner on these kind of things, I think. And you can do discovery in a way where it's irreducibly interpersonal. That's one way to say it, right? If
Right.
I'm doing discovery in a way that has me as face to face with the people I'm trying to discover as possible, then discovery is actually done through questioning. And that's true both of where are they and it's true of who are they. And so as I'm trying to find out, well, hey, what are other places? What are other restaurants here in the city that I might be able to go to in order to find this kind of food? Or is there some other grocery store somewhere where I can buy this kind of dish? Those questions, or where are they questions, right? But you can get into questions in the who are they category that are equally normal questions, right? Like, well, hey, now, I don't know anything about where you're from, and I'd learn to love more about it. What are there particular festivals that you celebrate where you're from, or how do you guys do family? Is your family structured kind of the same way that we are, or do you do it different? Do you have a big family or a small family? And then, of course, there's questions about faith that you're going to want to ask.
Mhm.
Uh, and so you can get into these questions in a pretty easy way. One of the tools that I often give to people in the who are they section. This is about as rudimentary as it gets. And remember, we're aiming for reproducible here, right? Uh, One thing that I often give it's a tool called the 5 F's. You'll see people that work in culture or cross cultural settings. Educators use this. It's very very easy, and I mean I can just explain it to you right now. So 5 F's, you can do it on your hand. Food, finances,
Okay.
faith,
Yeah.
festivals or fun, and family. Those are 5 categories that every culture ever, no matter where you are in the world, every culture has cultural artifacts in all 5 of those categories.
I like that. That's
Everybody
good.
ea Yeah, everybody eats a food. Everybody
Yep.
has a faith, even if that faith is atheistic, everybody has one. Everybody has festivals or things that they do for fun. Often festivals are tied to faith if you get
Oh,
down to the
that's right.
nitty gritty of it, right?
They can be.
So
Yep.
festivals often become an easy way to back into a faith conversation.
Mhm.
Family structure, how you deal with, how you think about, and how you deal with your money. These are all things that every culture does. And so you can sit down with a group of people in a church and you can list out those 5 things. One, you can teach them those 5 things on their hand
Yep.
and then have them sit down with a blank sheet of paper, write all 5 of those words down, and come up with 3 questions apiece under each word. Normal questions you just ask somebody as you're getting to know them. And that starts the process of cultural acquisition. You start learning about different cultural artifacts that this group has and that they hold dear and that they value, and being able to do that in an interpersonal way,
Mhm.
um, it helps you become a eventually a cultural expert in that group. And so you find out the things that are necessary for me to be able to understand how the gospel would speak with clarity to this particular people that we're engaging. There's another tool that I use on the who are they piece. So that's culture stuff. Worldview. So worldview typically gets deeper than culture. That deals with the guts of our religion, right? The way that we see the world is ultimately the stuff that makes up our beliefs,
Okay.
our ultimately our religion, right? Um, Another way to say that for us as Christians, the gospel is a worldview. That's what it is. If you try to cast it into anthropological language, the
Sure.
gospel is a worldview. So when we do contextualization work, we contextualize the culture, we confront their worldview because the gospel is the one true story of the whole world.
Right.
And whatever their worldview, if it's not the gospel, it's actually wrong. Now, there may be some valuable components to it in there somewhere, but at its kernel, if it's not based on what the gospel tells us is true of the world and who we are, it's not there, right? So, how do we understand or how do we do worldview acquisition work? So, there's 4 questions that I tend to give here. They're kind of high level. Uh, where did everything come from? What went wrong? What, if anything, can fix it? And where's it all going? Every group of people in the world, whether they realize it or not, people aren't necessarily self aware of this, but they exist in a way that their worldview answers those questions. Now,
Mhm.
that doesn't mean they've spent a whole lot of time pining over the answers to those questions. So you
Right.
may find people that aren't really
Right.
self-aware about their thoughts on it. But
Right.
their system to hold together where everything came from in like a cosmic sense, right? We're talking about creation here. What
Right.
went wrong? I have yet to meet anybody anywhere who would say it didn't go wrong.
Uh-huh.
Note the way that question's raised, it assumes things are wrong.
Right.
But I've yet to have anybody push back on me and say, no, no, I don't actually think things are wrong. I think they're just fine the way they are. Never ran into that. But along the way, you're going to get an answer to that. Well, it's
Yeah.
war, it's power, it's for the Christian, right? It's the curse of sin.
Right.
It's lack of education for some people. It's
Right.
ignorant. If everybody was just better educated, the world would be peaceful. There's all these different answers that you'll get to that. Uh, that's a gospel question. And then, of course, what if anything can fix it? Those 2
Right.
things are tied together. And then where's it all headed? That's an eschatology question, if you want to throw it back into systematic theology language. But those questions are like you can actually get into conversations with people about those things. And it helps you start to understand what the gospel would confront with this
Mhm.
particular group that you're trying to engage, right? So, where are they? And then who are they? Man, that's super important for gospel ministry. And what we've got to be able to do is we got to be able to teach our people in our churches how to do that work of contextualization and cross cultural communication without ever using the word contextualization or cross cultural communication. How do we do it in some simple and reproducible ways? So that's an important piece of it. The last thing I'll say about that before we get into the nuts and bolts of how to do the mapping. Um, if you do discovery this way, instead of doing it in some other potential, like, hey, let's sit down and let's scour over a whole bunch of census spreadsheets. That's one way to actually engage. And I'm not saying don't do that. That's actually something valuable about looking at your census data.
Okay.
But if your discovery is only based on census data that you came up with by looking at a computer, you missed an opportunity that is created by doing discovery work in an interpersonal way.
Sure.
Discovery done well actually naturally leads to engagement.
Okay.
One of the big pieces that we found early on as we were engaging in this work of trying to develop the system. So we had a team that piloted the discovery, the mapping process I'm fixing to tell you about. We had a team pilot it in Washington, D.C. Went up for a year. There were 3 or 4 or 5 of us. We went around and we were able to collect this beautiful map. Um, and we had, I don't know, about 1,000 points of interest on it. And you could categorize them based on people group. If you want to work with this group here, go here and engage them, do this, that, the other. Then, after we'd spent a long time gathering that information, we had this big, beautiful map. We said, now it's time, since we've done the discovery, to go talk to all of our churches in the area about the importance of engaging these people with the gospel. And we would go have conversations with church after
Yeah.
church after church. We'd meet with them, and they would be very impressed when they saw the work.
Okay.
And they'd even be convicted by it. Like, don't
Okay.
mishear me. It wasn't, "Oh, we don't care." But they'd look at it, they'd be shocked, some of them. I had no idea that group
Right.
was right here in our neighborhood.
Isn't
Um,
that amazing?
yeah, it is. And so it would, like, open their eyes. There'd even be some weightiness to their response,
Right.
and a few of them would say, "What do we do about it? I feel like you've convinced us we should do something."
Right.
But here's the problem with that. After that year-long pilot, even when we had churches that would say, we believe this is an important thing for us to do,
Hmm. Right.
not a single one of those churches was able to sustain a real strategy of engagement after
Hmm.
that pilot.
Oh no. Okay.
So there's the kind of the downside, but it taught us a super valuable lesson.
Hmm.
And here was the lesson: we did the discovery for them,
Yeah.
and in doing the discovery for them, we took the most valuable tool they'd have in creating an engagement process, getting to know the people that we were engaging to do the discovery.
Yep.
I had the relationships, they didn't have them.
Right.
And so what we learned, man, this was a super valuable lesson for us in the beginning. Discovery done well naturally leads to engagement. The reverse is unfortunately also true. Discovery done poorly, it becomes a barrier to actually being to do a good engagement strategy. The
Right.
earlier we could get a church engaged in the process of finding these people and actually developing and building the relationships themselves to ask the
Right.
questions. Not
Right.
only is the church finding out the information, they're gaining the relationship, they're gaining the
Yeah.
hearing. And in
Right.
doing so, they're starting to kind of knit their hearts to these people in a way
Sure.
that continues on into gospel ministry if done well. And so, man, that became critical for us in order to
That's
be able to
huge.
create some kind of engagement strategy.
Right.
So that presses us toward, if that's true, discovery, the mapping part. It has to be done as simple as possible, right?
Hmm. Right.
Here's the real quick on mapping. It's almost anticlimactic when you've had this whole conversation. The way we did mapping with that pilot, and it's still the way I tell people to engage in mapping. We had decided we were going to do this pilot. The very first weekend I was in DC, I was actually sitting in a Starbucks um, next to the National Archives. And it was 10:30. I was starting to get hungry. And this is a 6 million person metro. There's hundreds of people groups we know, but we have no idea where they are. Where do you even start? How do you map a city like this with a small team? And I'm despairing over this reality. We got to find some way to do it. And I'm getting hungry. So back then there was an app, an iOS app called Open Table.
Hmm.
Um,
Okay.
and Open Table, no, that wasn't the app. It wasn't Open Table. Open Table still a thing. It was Urban Spoon. That was the one. Urban
Urban spoon.
Spoon was this app to help you find a restaurant in a metro area. So I
Right.
pulled it up on my iPad and I'm kind of scrolling through the different options for restaurants because I want to go eat somewhere. And one of the categories, I was like, this is a weirdly specific category, but it was Ethiopian food.
Hmm.
So I hit the button for Ethiopian food and pins fell on my map. a bunch of pins. They just kind of fell onto the map. And I looked at that map and I thought, oh, that's where the Ethiopian people are.
Yeah.
And a light bulb went off.
Right.
If we can help people positively identify these points of interest,
Right.
and then they just walk in and they ask a simple set of questions, we
Yep.
capture that information, then we can start building an understanding or a database of where people are. So what we did, we created a Google form, just a
Okay.
simple online based web form that had 4 or 5 or 6 important questions on it. You need to know the name of the establishment. You want to know the type of the establishment. Is it a restaurant? Is it a
Sure.
temple or a mosque? Is it a dry goods store? So you want to know that kind
Mhm.
of stuff. um, Nationality of the people, and the mother tongue or the language they spoke in their home. Now
Yep.
here's why we asked those 2 questions, because this is where people tend to get hung up. They're like, "I don't know how to do people group mapping for ethno-linguistic people groups. That's a thing that anthropologists do." You're right, and if you ever use the word ethno-linguistic people group, you lose everybody in the room. In fact, if you walked into a restaurant and asked them, "Hey, what ethno-linguistic people group are you?" They're gonna look at you like you have a third eyeball. That term makes no sense to anybody. But here's what it means: ethno linguistic. Where are you from? What language do you speak?
Sure.
Ethno linguistic.
Mhm.
So if you can ask those 2 questions, you're within like 85, 90% of even knowing this group's people group identity. And so if
Sure.
you can ask those 2 questions, find out a bit of information, and then just put it into the Google form. So what we would do is we would train a church. Here's the form. Um, Save it onto the home screen of your phone,
Okay.
and let's go find places. If you see a place that looks weird, walk in, and just start asking questions. Be the dumb American tourist. Walk in and be like, "Hey, man, this place looks new. I've not been here before. I've lived in this area for a long time. Our church is just down the street, and we're trying to get to know our neighbors. And you guys look new, and so we thought we'd come in and introduce ourselves and see who you
Oh,
are."
that's great. That's
And then
great.
you start asking some questions. Well, don't do it in front of them, but when you
Well,
leave,
just start building relationships.
exactly so.
Yeah.
It's super low key. Then when
Yeah.
you leave and you get back in the car, take 30 seconds, fill out that little form on your phone, hit
Right.
send. Here's the
Right.
neat thing about the way that kind of stuff works now. If you've got a Google form, the
Mhm.
Google form automatically drops into a spreadsheet.
Okay.
And if you've got the name of the location and you've got its address and a couple of these other things in that spreadsheet, you can take that spreadsheet, and Google Maps will turn a spreadsheet into a map.
Okay.
And so we were able to send out a church team,
Yeah.
and say, "Hey, go collect whatever you collect." And then we could bring them back in and show them, "Here's all the
Right.
different places, and here's all the different information that you just found. And here's where it gets really cool at a network level. Something that simple can be taught to every one of your churches. You can crowdsource a map. So
Okay.
all of the churches in your association can share a map.
Yeah.
And then if you've got teams in your churches who are going out and they're asking these questions, they're getting to know these people, and they're collecting this information, everybody's information about the citywide level, it starts to grow together. And then churches
Does
start forming
does your
partnerships and
does
stuff.
your map get down to smaller granularity than a zip code?
Oh, sure it does. Because you're putting pins on the map at that point.
Okay.
And
Of
so
where
it'll
they
it
would
drops
be.
a pin on that particular point of interest.
Okay.
Now the trick to doing that kind of map, it's
Mhm.
pin based. It's point of interest based. And so
Sure.
you're looking for a cluster of pins. You're
Yeah.
not going to have like a polygon map about, hey,
Okay.
this is the census tract, and the census
Sure.
tract has X percentage concentration. It's not going
Just
to
gonna
give you
be
that kind of map.
wherever you met them.
That's exactly
Okay.
right.
Yeah.
And so
Okay.
what winds up happening is you're looking for concentrations of pins
Mhm.
at that point.
Gotcha.
Because if I've got 5 or 6 or 7 pins within a block of each other that are all the same group of people, and say one of them is, a restaurant, one of them is a market, one of them is a dry goods
Mhm.
store, a fabric store,
Mhm.
then I'm realizing, oh, okay, so this is a center for that people. This is where they come to get all of their stuff.
Right.
And so oftentimes you'll be able to find that there's maybe an apartment complex nearby where a whole bunch of them live, or something to that effect. So
Right.
you're looking for that kind of detail. Now, from a high level, if you know how to use census data, you can actually take churches doing this grassroots people group discovery work and lay it on top of a map that does things
Right.
like a census tract,
Yeah.
polygon,
Right.
concentration, and it starts becoming very powerful information for you.
That's
Um,
great.
yeah. So that's, I mean, that's
We're
the
we're
simple
gonna need to be
process.
we're gonna be need to be wrapping up. I would love to
Sure.
continue to have this, but I do have some questions,
Yeah. Hit
and
me. Hit me.
let's do this. Um, how much worldview needs to be understood in order to be relevant with the gospel?
Yeah. So that's a great question. At some sense, at some level, the answer is zero. Zero. At
Okay.
some level.
Right.
Um, because there's a sense where the Holy Spirit can, I mean, God is in the business of hitting straight licks with crooked sticks all the time. Um,
Sure.
so ultimately, we're called to obedience and proclamation of the gospel. Now,
Okay.
that said, we're also called to wisdom and discernment in how we do it.
Hmm.
We're called to doing so in a way that creates clarity. You've got tons of biblical evidence of how Paul was very careful and how he
Right.
contextualized his message. And so I think
Yes.
the overwhelming testimony of scripture is that it is very important and we want to be able to do it well. But I also think you see in scripture that Paul did it well in places and didn't do it so well in some places. I mean,
That's
we
true.
do have to remember that Paul got accused of being um, um, which god was it? Was it Mercury? Which one is the messenger god? So Barnabas was Zeus, and Paul was, can't think of his name to save my life now in
Hermes.
Greek. Yes, that's it. Hermes. That's the one. Right. So Zeus and Hermes. Right. I was thinking the Roman version of it.
You're okay.
So they got, like, he got done with a shtick. They still got accused of being
Mhm.
gods, and they could just barely keep the people from
Right.
from worshiping them.
Yeah. Sacrificing, giving to. Yeah.
Right. And this was early on in his journey. So so you
Yeah.
see him over time even developing in his ability to contextualize
Sure.
the gospel well, I think.
Sure.
So it's very important. We need to aim for it. The better we can understand it, the more clear our presentation becomes. And a thing that I think is important for us to realize, the we're not trying to make the gospel trendy. We're trying to make it understandable. That's the
Yeah.
purpose of contextualization.
Yeah.
It needs to be clear.
Okay. Sure.
Um, yeah.
Hey, in the last 3 minutes,
Okay.
what would you want to tell an AMS about their association and these different immigrant groups that are in their midst?
Yeah. So, man, there's so much. But the one thing I'll say that's in the vein of what we just talked about,
Yeah.
there has been, when I have watched a church's light bulb go off on this kind of
Okay.
stuff,
All right.
it has become often significant catalyzing force in that own church's renewal.
Oh, okay.
And so, if you're in a situation where you have churches that um, need their own revitalization, they need their own renewal, they need their own
Hmm.
refocusing on the Great Commission, oftentimes trying to get them to create some kind of big international mission strategy is not, that may not happen yet. But across the street or down the road, here's a real opportunity for them to engage in and recall and remember what the Great Commission tastes like. And I say it that way
Yeah.
on purpose, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
If
No,
you
that's
can
good.
give them a taste of it through something like this, it actually winds up having all kinds of downstream consequences in a number of ways.
Amen. That's awesome. Keelan, Keelan Cook, Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary, thank you for being with us today. And send me those links and we'll get these out to the AMSs. And that sounds really good. I'm going to turn the recorder off right now. Maybe. I can't tell if it goes off or not. Oh, there it is.